Yeah, it's interesting. I get asked this question a lot. So obviously, if I'm coming up in a conversation with a brand new believer who's never read the Bible, I'm not going to recommend they start with the Gospel of Thomas, right? I mean, that's probably pretty self-evident. And if I've come even if I come across a person who's been a believer for many years but still has never really spent much time studying the Bible, I'm like, look, if you have time constraints, start with the Bible, start with the Gospel, start with the New Testament, what have you. Okay, fair enough. Uh, but there are helpful things about reading these other accounts. One of the main things I think that they show us very quickly when people read them is they realize how bizarre, weird, and different they are than the Gospels we have in our Bibles. Lots of times people say, "Oh, I think the Gospel of Thomas, or let's say the Gospel of Peter, I think it's just as valid as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John." Okay, you can say that, but have you actually read these Gospels? Have you actually understood what they've said? Because if you have, you realize this is not just you know, time difference in terms of when they're written, but the qualitative difference is massive. We're talking about a different theology, different doctrine, just sort of a different Jesus. And so you can't sort of reconcile them with the canonical four. And I think that's actually really good for Christians to realize. And it dawns on people, oh, I see. There was a reason why our gospels made it into the canon and not others, because not all gospels are the same. So we have this sort of democratized version of things like, well, no, there's no difference in any gospel. All the gospel, it's just a matter of which one you prefer. It's just your preference. No, they're different. They're very different. And so reading them can actually highlight that. And I think that can be a good thing. One of the things that people may not realize about these apocryphal gospels, these lost gospels, is they often fill in the gaps left by the canonical four. And here's what I mean by that. When you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, most people never pause to wonder much about what's not in there. They think about what is in there, but they don't ever reflect on how remarkably restrained our gospel authors are in terms of what they don't tell you. One example is that when you read all four gospels, you actually don't have a live shot eyewitness testimony of Jesus being resurrected. No one's there to watch him walk out of the tomb. Now, you could ask a pretty reasonable question. If you were making up a story about Jesus being resurrected from the dead, wouldn't you have placed an eyewitness right there on the scene to say, yeah, I saw it happen? But when the women show up to the tomb, Jesus is already gone. He's already resurrected. They've missed it, so to speak, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John just tell us that when they arrived that the tomb is already empty, almost as if that's what happened, that they showed up when he was already gone. Well, that's a remarkably restrained analysis, right? It sounds very credible. But when you get to the Gospel of Peter, it's actually one of these later Gospels that fills in that gap for us by showing us a live eyewitness shot of Jesus coming out of the tomb. And you can see that it's really designed to sort of cater to people's curiosities. What would it have been like to watch Jesus come out of the tomb? Well, in the Gospel of Peter, Jesus comes out of the tomb, but he's like 60 feet tall, right? His head touches the clouds. He's giant Jesus, which is like bizarre, flanked by these two angels, right? So he's just sort of this Godzilla Jesus coming out of the tomb, as I joke with my students. But then it gets even more bizarre because out of the tomb behind Jesus is this floating cross that follows Jesus out of the tomb, which is strange because, I don't know how the cross got in there. It's not like that's normally what Romans do when they kill you. Hey, take the cross home with you, So there's that bizarreness. But then the cross starts to talk, which is even more weird. So this is why I think it can be helpful for people to read these stories. Like, oh man, you can see this is later embellished and bizarre. And that's actually not that unusual in a lot of these stories.